Tonight, federal judge Emmett Sullivan is beginning his 90 days of thinking about whether he should lock up this guy.
We do not need a reckless president who believes she is above the law. Lock her up. That's right. That's right. Lock her up.
Leading off our discussion tonight, Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor, David Corn, Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones, and Daniel Goldman, former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. All are MSNBC contributors. And Jill, I want to get your reaction to what happened in that courtroom today. It's supposed to be the smoothest thing that you could possibly walk into, sentencing where prosecutors recommending no incarceration, and here we are.
Well, I think I predicted that there was a big mistake made by the lawyers for Flynn in stating that the FBI had misled him, that he hadn't been warned. You can't do that in a document that starts out by saying that you're a 33-year veteran, that you're a general, that you were the Director of National Security for the United States of America, but you didn't know that it was illegal to lie to the FBI. And I felt that the judge might react very negatively to that. I didn't predict quite this much negativity, but I think that it was deserved, that you can't have it both ways. Was he trying to get a pardon and please Donald Trump at the same time as he was fully cooperating? Obviously, he deserves something for his cooperation, but he should not have done what he did. And a lot of this reminded me of Watergate, where the crimes were committed in the White House, were committed in the Attorney General's office. And that somehow did make it seem worse. So I understand why Judge Sullivan was so upset about the location of the crime.
And Daniel, in fairness to Michael Flynn's lawyers, who are the ones who wrote all this stuff that seems to have provoked the judge today, they explained it, I thought, reasonably well. They said that the reason we were specifying this stuff about not being warned is that some of the other people in this investigation were in fact warned that lying to the FBI is a crime, and they still lied. And so he said he was just trying to distinguish it from some of the other cases.
And he went on to say, please don't punish my client for this argument that I made.
And the judge assured everyone that he would not punish the client for the argument that the lawyers made.
And I think that's probably right. I think the reason this went off the rails was not because of that misguided and mistaken argument. And Jill is right, it was. I think the judge sort of cleared that up early and moved on. What sent this really off the rails is I think the judge was not as much upset at Michael Flynn for that argument, but was upset a little bit with Robert Mueller and his office for the sweetheart deal that Michael Flynn seems to have gotten, where he did not have to plead guilty to the egregious conduct that he engaged in getting paid by Turkey to lobby against the U.S. while he is Trump's primary national security advisor on the campaign. And that he did not plead guilty to that conduct. That conduct was not a part of his sentencing guidelines and the pre-sentence report. And what really jumped out at me is that the judge thought to himself, this is worse than a 0 to 6 guideline sentence that you have here. And you got that because the special counsel's office agreed not to charge you for worse conduct. But I'm going to consider that conduct. And right now, your cooperation isn't complete. And it may not be. He didn't say it wasn't, but he certainly indicated that it may not be enough cooperation to get you down to that probation sentence. So I really took this more as a rebuke of the special counsel's office than I did of Michael Flynn and his lawyers.
And David Corn, the president's tweet this morning saying, in effect, that, Michael Flynn was entrapped by these FBI agents. Sarah Sanders saying earlier this morning that Michael Flynn was entrapped by FBI agents. All of that is stuff that the judge could be very well aware of, and the judge could have decided we really have to smack this down, which he did by asking those questions of Michael Flynn.
I think he wanted to make clear that this was a serious crime, and he didn't want to give Flynn any wiggle room and to come out later and say, well, it wasn't a real crime, I was entrapped. And so he got him on the record saying, and the lawyers, yes, this was a serious crime, regardless of what they put in the pre-sentencing memo. And, I was struck by something you said in your opening, Lawrence, about this not being treason but betrayal. And there's a betrayal that hasn't come up today because it's not part of this case. And that betrayal is that Flynn, with Trump, in mid-summer of 2016, got an intelligence briefing and was told that Moscow was behind the hacking and the dumping of material that was part of a Russian plan to subvert the election, to interfere in the election. And at that point on, Trump publicly kept saying it wasn't the Russians, and Flynn, who had been part of this briefing, stood by silently as Donald Trump echoed and amplified Russian disinformation. I think both of them committed a severe act of betrayal then, which we're not seeing much talk about because it's not part of this criminal case.
I'm going to read something that Michael Flynn's lawyer said in court today, which I think might be, for Donald Trump, the very worst words that were said in court today, way worse than the talk about treason. This is Michael Flynn's lawyer telling the judge, from the beginning of this process, literally from the beginning, General Flynn has cooperated with Director Mueller and special counsel's investigation in every way imaginable, and he's prepared to continue that cooperation. And Jill Wine-Banks, I don't know who's going to tell Donald Trump that Michael Flynn has been cooperating from the beginning in every way imaginable.
Well, I don't think it'll be his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. He said, after all, nobody died, so this isn't a serious crime. Obviously, Judge Sullivan doesn't agree with Rudy Giuliani, but maybe, even on Fox News, I mean, you had them saying in advance, well, maybe the judge is going to dismiss his plea of guilty because there's no evidence there. And boy, are they embarrassed now, because it was the exact opposite. Someone has to get through to Donald Trump that he is in jeopardy and that he can't keep getting away with it. This has been a week of terrible fraud and criminality. His charity is now shut down because of its pattern and practice of bad behavior. And then you have this happening and the warning that somebody who he was very close with, and let's look at why is he so close and so protective of Flynn? Why is he saying, good luck to you, Mr. Flynn, but you, Mr. Cohen, are a rat? They both are cooperating. What does he not get? I don't understand it. I hope someone can explain it.
Daniel, the judge said more than once, he said this line, there's a great deal of non-public information in this case. He was actually saying at that point, I want to make sure I don't reveal any of it. But that's a huge piece of what was going on today. There's a great deal of non-public information in this case, which the judge knows when he's considering what to do with this sentence.
But on the flip side, and maybe an answer to Jill's question, is that Flynn's lawyer indicated that the only additional cooperation that Flynn may be able to engage in is to testify in that Eastern District of Virginia case. That means, to me at least, as I read this, that there is no expectation that he will testify in a future case brought by the special counsel's office. It may be that his information is going to be used by the special counsel to charge additional people. But ordinarily, if a prosecutor uses information to charge someone from a witness, that witness is prepared to testify. So there is a little bit of a silver lining, I think, that you can take if you're Donald Trump and his other associates. And perhaps that is why he has been so supportive of Michael Flynn to date.
And let's listen to what Congressman Schiff said today, Adam Schiff, about this. He tweeted, after the judge acknowledged the seriousness of Flynn's conduct, he was allowed Trump's former national security advisor to defer sentencing until after he has fully cooperated with the government. And then here's the important line. It will be important that Flynn also cooperate with our committee and testify. And so, David Corn, it looks like Michael Flynn has a long career ahead of him as a witness.
I hope so, because it goes back to this point that we've talked about before. Robert Mueller is not in charge of telling us the whole story of what happened. He's in charge of bringing criminal cases that he thinks he can reasonably prosecute. Michael Flynn, I have associates of his, I reported this last week, who say that he had meetings with Kislyak before the election. Kislyak once told the Washington Post he had meetings with Flynn before the election, not the things that he got into trouble with the FBI interview later. So we in the public don't know for sure if these meetings happened and what was discussed. And did these happen while the Kremlin was attacking the United States? Was Trump's national security guy talking in friendly terms or even cutting prospective deals with the ambassador from Moscow? I mean, those are the type of questions that the House Intelligence Committee should have taken up, which they didn't under the Republicans, which I hope Adam Schiff and now the Democrats will take a good, hard look at.
David Corn, Jill Wine-Banks, Daniel Goldman, thank you for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.